Unfortunately, she was very obvious. They could see that she was there. You know, when the abuse started at her home that night, during the night, she ran. And she ran to the one place that meant safety to her, the school. She didn't take time to put on her coat, mittens, boots. She ran in her jammies barefoot. She was lying on a jammies barefoot on a snowdrift in front of the school. Fortunately, it was not a weekend, it was not a holiday, and she was found fairly quickly. She had not started having permanent physical damage in that case with the hypothermia. When we're talking about starvation or malnutrition, we don't see nearly as much of this in Iowa as we see in some of our states. We don't see nearly as much of this in the United States as we see in other countries. The current statistics out of Africa are that there are over 700 kids a day that are starving to death, that are losing their lives because of malnutrition. You know, we don't have that kind of a situation here, fortunately. But what we might see behavior. Have you ever been passing a convenience store and you saw a kid run? You know, usually if you follow through with what happened, usually it's because they've stolen something and they're out the door as fast as they can get. Now, it might be something they want, like an iPod, a DVD player, something like that. But a lot of times, especially if they are hungry, they will steal either something they can sell to buy food, but more often they will steal food. And I know a Snickers tastes better than a banana. Okay, it does. But likewise, the body instinctively recognizes the Snickers as a higher energy source than a banana. And so the child, it'll look like they stole something that's okay as a piece of candy, but it might be their energy source to give them the boost that they need. What you might see in a medical situation, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking about home or if we're talking about a medical center, what you might see again is behavior. You serve a tray of food to the child in a short period of time, poof, magic, everything's gone. Now, anything that's not sealed, usually at meat, potatoes and gravy, sometimes a veggie or a salad, they'll eat that as absolutely as fast as they can stuff it in. But anything that is still sealed, cracker packages, pudding cups, beverages, those kind of things, if you look in their room, you're going to find it stashed. Now, part of it is they know what hunger is like at 2 o'clock in the morning, and they know they have food there. But the other part is psychological. When that child gets discharged, they get to go home, or if they're already at home, you know, to change it just slightly, you know, what they're going to go home, they're going to go home the hero, because they're going to be able to take a gift of food to their brothers and sisters. And so in the United States, we see more of that behavior than we see that super skin and bones of starvation. How many of you are familiar, let's do it the other way, how many of you are not familiar with the term turgor or skin turgor? I'm going to show you, this is the only role play hands-on we're going to do. We're not getting into little groups with it. But I want everybody to put your hands out like this, and I want you to gently pick up the skin on the back of one hand, and I want you to let it go. Does it go back down? Does everybody's go back down? Mine doesn't. You know, I'm not sure that you can see that, but when I pick that skin up, see how mine stays peaked up? It doesn't smooth out really fast. It stays peaked up. I am slightly dehydrated. I'm about a quart low. You know, if I pump liquids for the next couple of hours, that'll help that. But mine's part medical too. I have a medical problem. But that's what turgor is. Turgor is the measurement of fluid or hydration in your tissue. And so obviously I am a little low. Mine doesn't smooth out right away. I was doing a training in front of a group and there were no medical people in the audience at all. And so no one knew what I was going to do. And so when I showed the people about it, and before I could say it, and the reason for that is that I'm slightly dehydrated, the lady in front said, the reason for that is you're old. Verbal abuse is not a separate recognized category. It was really tough for me not to react to what she said. It is not a symptom of aging. It is a sign of dehydration. Skin turgor, it's a good measurement. You know, teach other people to do that too. You know, because there's times, you know, where we're high physical activity, we may be exercising, we may be outside in the heat of the summer, participating in sports. You know, check yourself periodically to know what your fluid level is. In the same category, the word contractures. Now, a contracture is when the ligaments, the tendons, the joints, the ligaments, tendons, and muscles of a joint shrink, atrophy, draw up. The best visual that I could actually tell you about so that you would see that, if you know anyone with cerebral palsy. Usually fingers, elbows, body, knees, and if they're able to walk, it's kind of in that disjointed type of walk. Those are all contractures. Other than something like cerebral palsy, we don't see as many contractures in children as we see in adults. Now if we have a child that is tied up, confined, caged, where they can't stretch out and exercise their joints, we may see some of that. Otherwise, we see more of it in adults. When we go to the top of the next category, which is a detached retina, the retina is the back of your eyeball. That's what allows you to see. If in fact that retina or that very thin tissue, if it is torn or totally detached, we're talking about the potential of partial blindness, if not total blindness. The number one cause of a detached retina in a child is shaken baby. Child's grabbed and they literally are shaken. If you think their head and their skull and their brain is colliding. And so that's going to tear or detach that thin membrane behind their eye. The second cause of a detached retina in a child is slammed baby, dropped head first or whopped. It's that sudden harsh blow, that is going to tear or detach that very fine membrane of their eyes. But think about the size of somebody that I could pick up and shake, or that I could pick up and slam. We're talking about the youngest of our young children, our very small kids. Okay? They're also the age group and the maturity level, the vocal skills. For the most part, they're not going to be able to say, Di, there's a problem here. I'm missing part of this room. I can't see, or there's something wrong. And so because they're not going to be able to tell us there's a problem with their vision, sometimes we're not going to get them help fast enough to preserve their sight. And so they're going to end up with either a partial or a total blindness, one eye or both. So that detached retina. Okay, we'll talk about the differences again when we're talking about dependent adults, because it is slightly different with that. When we're talking about pressure sores, we don't see as many pressure sores, and definitely not all the way to a decubitus as we see with children as we see in adults. But what we might see in a child a lot of times starts with diaper rash. And it could be that their diaper isn't being changed. It also could be, if you have a chronic bedwetter, the philosophy, you wet it, you live in it. Okay, and so it starts out as the wet and the contact, etc. It starts out as usually as diaper rash, and then you'll see the skin starting to break down. And so we'll end up with some additional problems with it, but usually not all the way that we're talking about muscle, bone, those type of problems with it. And so we don't see as many pressure sores in children. If we're talking about choking, the purpose of choking someone is to choke them to death. Now, I know sometimes it's used for other purposes, but that's the number one reason for it. If the perpetrator plans to do that, usually they'll come armed. They'll take time to bring something with them, a rope, a necktie, twine, a wire, so they'll come armed to get the job done. But a lot of times it is just, once again, just like having a hot liquid thrown, a lot of times it's just that total frustration, that instant reaction of just, ugh! And sometimes, if I ask you to do it right now, to hook your fingers, to tighten them up, and then release them, that's fairly easy for us to do. But try it sometime when you're totally stressed. Try linking your fingers, and now try unlinking them. And it's even tougher to do because of the stress level, because of our adrenaline that spikes with it. Okay, and so a lot of times the intent isn't there to start with. It isn't, I intend to choke you so. A lot of times it's just that, and once they've started, it's really tough to release the tension on their hands to stop. And so sometimes it didn't start as an attempt, but they got the job done. If the person has been choked to death, and especially if we're talking about manual with the hands, within 20 minutes, half an hour, you're actually going to be able to count 8 fingerprints and 2 thumbprints. You'll be able to see exactly what happened, that it was manually done. Okay. When we're up at the top of the scale and we're talking about death and murder, we have lost a lot of kids in Iowa. We find them in abandoned vehicles, abandoned buildings, dumpsters, garbage cans, ditches. We find throwaway children. In 2001, Iowa legislator passed the Safe Haven Act. And basically what that meant was that as long as the child was under that 14 days, that 2-week window, as long as they were below 14 days of age, they could be taken to any medical base and given up. If they did that, under 14, given up, then they would not be charged with abandonment, they would not be charged with child endangerment. Since Iowa passed the law in 2001, the latest statistics I'm aware of is there were 18 Iowa babies whose lives have potentially been saved because of Safe Haven. I don't know if any of you heard it or paid attention to what happened in Nebraska in this past year. Now, they passed a Safe Haven law, but unfortunately they didn't put an age limit on it. And the number one age of children that were brought back were 16-year-olds. I can't do this anymore. They actually had people driving in and flying in from other states to turn in their teenagers. Okay, and so Nebraska had to get together again, legislator, and say, let's put an age on it. Okay, and so in Iowa, it's that 14 days, so that 2-week window. Medical base, it could be the dentist, the school nurse, your EMS or your emergency medical services, like with the fire department. It could be the medical center. Okay, so medical base. Sometimes, we hear about specific cases that will always stick with us or names. If I say Shelby Duez, some of you are going to remember this absolutely adorable 3-year-old that was murdered in a drug-related situation. If we're talking about Josetta Gage, it was a sexual assault, and then a brother of the original perpetrator kidnapped her and murdered her. And so we're talking about a sexually related situation. A couple months ago, we had a man in the Des Moines area that he was taking care of 3 children, a 4-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1.5-year-old. He popped all 3 kids in the bathtub and he went downstairs to play computer games. Now the 3-year-old and the 4-year-old didn't realize that when their little sister slipped under the water that she wasn't playing a game. They actually got out of the bathtub and left their little sister beneath the water. The father is going to serve time. We had a mother that drowned her newborn and then hanged herself. So we had a murder-suicide. And so we have lost children in Iowa. From a national perspective, we had a 14-year-old that gave birth to a child at school. Now a lot of people didn't even realize that she was pregnant. Where we wear layered clothes or body structure, sometimes it isn't obvious when someone is pregnant. She gave birth in the bathroom. She panicked. She tried to flush the newborn. Plumbing, baby. So now we have a 14-year-old that is responsible the rest of her life for the death of a child. Sometimes we're talking about that abuse starts at the lower end of the scale. Sometimes it starts at the top. The first baby born in the United States in January of 2008 died in March 2008 as a 2-month-old. There had never been any police reports for domestic violence. There had never been any police reports for child abuse, and there were 2 older siblings. Mom trusted Dad with the baby, always had, never been a problem. When she got home, the baby was in his swing and he wasn't responding. She rushed him to the emergency room where he was pronounced dead. He had been shaken so hard that the amount of bleeding inside his skull into his brain is what the pressure is what actually caused his death. He had been shaken so hard that both retina were completely detached. And so even if he had if he had lived, the possibility he would have at least partial, if not total blindness in one eye or both. And when they checked his little rib cage, they actually could count 8 fingers, 2 thumbs. Dad couldn't get the baby to stop crying, just grabbed him and shook him. There was no intent, but it still cost the life of a child. So now we have a family missing a 2-year-old, but Dad is serving time, so they're missing him also. Sometimes you're going to see abuse start at the very bottom of the scale. Sometimes you're going to see it start at the top. Sometimes it's going to start lower down, and as the frustrations, anxiety, problems start to increase, you may see it jumping categories and getting progressively more severe. Dentists have actually been doing, a dental association nationwide, have been doing a lot of study on what is happening in the dental field and abuse of people. And so they actually are saying, when you've got broken teeth, cracked teeth, especially with a younger child, the little piece of skin between your gums and your lips, if it's torn, if there's damage to the roof of your mouth, a soft palate, They're actually finding that the cause of that usually is force feeding. It could be force feeding with a hot liquid too. And so it's jamming the spoon in, jamming the food in, that's going to cause that kind of damage. And so they actually are becoming aware of the fact that they are treating victims of abuse. They also are noticing that they're seeing a lot, they're recognizing sexual assault of children. Again, just noticing the difference in the problems. If you think about the different professions that look at us from here to here, dentists usually are the number one type of profession that does literally look at us neck and up. And so they are aware of those kind of problems more so than a lot of other fields are. When we're talking about different photos, you do have my permission to shut your eyes. You have my permission to turn away. You do not have to look at the photos. When we're talking about child abuse, this child was taken to the emergency room. The caretaker said that the child was crawling on the carpet in the living room, slipped and hit the side of his face on the leg of the coffee table. Okay, if you see this much damage on a child in the first place, you're going to have to report it regardless of what the story is. But there's a couple problems here. This child isn't old enough, mature enough to be crawling. Story doesn't match. In addition, unless it's a real modular type of coffee table with a really wide surface, a coffee table leg cannot cause that much damage with it. So when challenged, the caretaker said, "You're right, that isn't what happened. We had him in his car seat on the couch and we didn't have it secured. And as he moved, he actually rolled off and the car seat landed on top of him. That's probably what happened. But right up front, you're going to have to make the report based on the amount of damage and then add to it that you've got two different stories." This child is too young to be doing anything. They're not going to run away from home. They're not going to break curfew. This child only does the normals: eat, sleep, drink, etc. This baby was crying and was slapped so hard that those purple stripes that you see across her temple and her cheek, that's the spaces between the fingers. Those are actually finger marks from a slap. From now on, when you look at bruises, I want you to think about rainbow. A rainbow has a wide variety of colors all at the same time. If you see bruises that are a wide variety of colors at the same time, generally you're talking about more than one incident. So that rainbow effect, you have more than one color, multiples, you're going to have to report it. This particular case, I'm not sure what was used to beat the child, but if you look closely, you're going to see some browns, some greens, some yellow of old bruises, but then you're also going to see some reds, some purples, some blues of newer bruises. Ears are something we don't think a lot about. When was the last time you thought about your ears? You change an earring or you get water in it. Other than that, they're just there. When I was in second grade, our music teacher had us sitting in this big circle on the floor, and he walked to the outside of the circle. If any of us misbehaved, he just came up behind us and picked us up by both ears, full body weight on ears. But something else that we really don't think about is that this part of our ear, the outside of our ear, is just the funnel for our hearing. Our whole hearing mechanism is inside the skull. And so whatever damage there is on the outside could easily be that much damage on the inside of the skull. This child, the bruising actually goes all the way back through that curve of his hairline. Could easily be that much bruising inside his head and much bleeding. He does have a broken eardrum. It's a pressure pop. He was hit hard enough straight on that it blew his eardrum. And we don't think about it as how much damage can be done. This child could very easily be that 12-year-old that tells you they have been spanked so hard they can't sit down. This child was beaten with a PVC pipe, your white plastic conduit. Bite marks are something else we don't think a lot about. Now, if this is reported as a dog bite, we'd all panic. Where's the dog? Do we have it confined? Does the child have to have rabies shots? But in fact, people bite more often than dogs do. And with the exception of a cat bite, the human bite is the most dangerous animal bite. Only a cat has more bacteria, virus, etc. in their mouth than a human does. And then there's two kinds of bites. Is it a child bite? Is it an adult bite? A lot of times children, when they're in those early growth and development stages where they're sucking their thumb, they're cutting teeth, they're gnawing on things, a lot of them will bite. And sometimes it only happens once. They bite, they get hit, they don't bite again. Or they bite and it doesn't taste good with lotions, colognes, etc. If you have a child that continues to bite, you're talking about potentially some behavior modification. But then adults bite. The 2 times that we see an adult biting a child, one, either the child has bitten the adult, or it could be that a daycare provider, a babysitter says, hey, Susie bit Tommy in daycare today. Okay, and so the adult is going to say, how would you like to know how that felt? And they bite the child to show them biting hurts. But we also have adults that are psychosocial deviants that gnaw. It's just like corn on the cob. It's just that repetitive type of biting. Okay, so you can see that sometimes, obviously, those are psychosocial deviants too, and they're going to have some counseling with it. So we need to look at a bite as a potential danger for that. Cigarette burn goes all the way to the knuckle. Rope burns, and actually the ankles looked the same. The child has been tied up. We're starting to see some of these in drug cultures. We're going to cook meth at my house tonight, and my child, he's a Houdini. I can put him down in his bed, and he can not only get out of his bed, he can get out of any room. He is fast. I don't want him out here with all of the chemicals and the methamphetamine, so I better tie him up in his bed to keep him safe. We're also seeing it with sexual deviant problems. I have some really kinky friends. They like sex and babies. Okay, I'm just keeping my child safe. And so it's totally wrongful thinking. Sometimes the intent isn't there to harm the child. Sometimes it's a choice between 2 evils. Tie the child up, protect them. And so sometimes it's a choice of lesser evils with that. When we're talking about the slide that this would be considered an anklet burn, the child was dunked feet first into water that was too hot, and you can see the depth of the liquid. When we're talking about fractures of children, children's bones don't have as much calcium as the adult bone. Okay, and so if you were outside and you pick up a twig off of the ground, a lot of times you can go like that and snap it straight across. You may actually take it over a knee to break it, but it'll break pretty much straight across. Children's bones are more like the twig or the branch that you cut off the tree. It's a green stick. You can bend, and eventually it will snap. Usually it'll snap at an angle. Children's bones are sometimes referred to as green stick fractures, because just like the green twig, part of the bark would be still hooked together. The same way as far as bone, it can have the outside of the bone still hooked together. So we usually see them in a spiral type of fracture, such as that one. And that one. This child's bone is broken pretty much straight across. This is the femur, the upper thigh bone. The caretaker said that the baby was taking his nap, and while he was asleep, he dropped his leg through the bars of the bed. He woke up, his body was on one side, his leg was on the other, and he fought and he twisted and he turned till he broke his own leg. Okay, first of all, it probably didn't happen that way. It probably can't happen that way. All of us as humans have a pain threshold, okay, and that's individual to us. But when we have reached our individual pain threshold, we will quit fighting. And so at the point before this child broke his leg, he would have stopped. He would still continue to scream frustration and pain, but probably he would not have gone on to the point of actually breaking a leg. But let's say it happened that way. Where are the safety factors? Iowa's law, the bars on a baby bed cannot be more than 2 3/8 inches apart. That's the width of a pop can, not a pop bottle, the width of a pop can. The chances of him even getting his chubby little leg through the bars, doesn't exist. But even if he did it and actually broke his own leg, he's going to be screaming bloody murder. Somebody should have heard him. Somebody should have gotten to him before he actually broke the bone. Where the arrow is a depressed skull fracture. Caretaker said that she was doing the laundry, and as she came through the kitchen, she accidentally hit her child in the back of the head with the laundry basket. Being facetious, unless she's washing bricks, it could not have happened that way. Okay, it has to be something harder or heavier than a laundry basket to do a depressed skull fracture. How many of you have ever had a black eye? Think about it, where was it black? And most of the time we're going to say here, along our cheekbone, one side, both sides. Occasionally we'll have a black eye that's the entire eye. And usually it's if it's a direct blow, either with a fist, usually it's with a baseball or a softball, that we'll see that complete circle of a bruise. If you see a bruise that is just the upper eyelid and a severe bruise with it, generally it means that there's a fracture of the skull above the point, above the eye. In this particular photo, the dip in her eyebrow, there is a fracture of the skull. Father got angry, he doubled up his fist and he whopped her one, and he caught her high in the forehead and literally broke the skull. And so it was just the upper eyelid. The only time I've personally seen it where it was that severe and just the upper eyelid, my guys were in weight training for football, and there were no adults in the weight room. They weren't doing safe type of weight lifting. They didn't have spotters. So one of their friends actually was bench pressing. At the same time, another friend stood over him curling with a dumbbell and dropped the dumbbell. You know, it hit the other young guy right in the forehead and broke the skull. It was instant that it was just the upper eyelid that was black and blue. So it's very distinctive if you see that happen. Mongolian spots are birthmarks. You know, we see them in this photo across his forehead, down across his temple, upper cheek. We also have them in the next photo where we have them around the ankle, around the knee. Okay? So we're talking about birthmarks. Okay, but you know, unless we have the birth record in front of us and know that these are birthmarks, we're going to have to report it. Okay, but we can't report it as either Mongolian spots or bruises because it's not up to us to make that decision. So we're going to have to report it as that there are these areas on the face, on the body. We're going to see the Mongolian spots or birthmarks generally in newborns with darker complexions. African Americans can be Asians, Hispanics can be Italians, Mid-Eastern, Native Alaskans, American Indian, can be a wide variety of people where we're talking about darker complexioned at birth. Okay? So we're going to report them as areas that are darker than their normal skin tones. You may say, what color they are, but is there any rainbow effect? Do you see multiple colors that would indicate that these are bruises rather than birthmarks? The other thing is, how is the child acting? You get into their space. Do they duck? Do they hide? Do they try to get away from you? Are they used to being hit? But unless you have the birth record and know, you're going to have to report these. Anyone have any idea what this is? It's called Kaogao or coining. It's an Asian medical spiritual practice. So we're talking cultural diversity, and most of us have had our classes. Okay, and so we're going to end up with a little bit of a problem in what is our personal philosophy and the law. And we'll talk about this as far as is it child abuse in just a moment. The child has either had an upper respiratory infection or has a backache. And a silver coin, which is how it got its name as coining. A silver coin, a silver spoon, edge of a porcelain cup or a porcelain plate is rubbed really hard over the area that's affected. It's like rubbing out the spirits, rubbing out the disease. And we'll talk about it as far as abuse in a moment. Anyone have an idea what this is? It's called cupping. I used to say that it was primarily a Hispanic medical spiritual practice, but I do a lot of work with translators and interpreters throughout the state of Iowa, and I also know now that the Ukrainian spiritual medical practice uses a cupping technique, Chinese medicine, Sudanese. We have a lot of Sudanese population coming into Iowa, and so it is more than just a Hispanic medical spiritual cultural practice. But again, we're talking cultural diversity. These are not burns in this particular slide. They are, though, like a hot hickey. A suction cup has been heated and has been applied to the skin. It's like sucking out the bad spirits, sucking out the disease. In some cultures, actually, there are herbs added to it that they really would be circular burns. So then let's talk about it from the standpoint of child abuse. I have one friend who's a child abuse investigator, and she said, of course these two are child abuse. And she said, but the caretakers, the parents may be new to Iowa and may not understand Iowa law. So she said she'll go to their home and she'll talk to them about it. And she'll tell them, I'm not going to make a report this time. I'm just going to hang on to this information. If I'm called here again, I'll have to report it as child abuse. I have another friend who is a child abuse investigator. She said, wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. They have a right to their spiritual medical practices. Okay, and so we have a difference of opinion even within the State Department that investigates child abuse. So then my first friend says, well, let's talk about the law. The father of either of these children is driving down a city street and runs a red light. An officer pulls him over and says, excuse me, sir, are you aware that you ran a red light? And he says, hey, we don't have red lights in my country. Is he going to get a ticket? Yes. Not a warning. Will get a ticket. I checked on that. So it is against the law, and we're still going to have to report it. Depends on the beliefs of the people investigating, whether it's considered abuse or not considered abuse. We're going to switch. We're going to talk about sexual abuse. Sexual abuse jumps from civil to criminal law really almost faster than any other type of abuse situations, and definitely within like a 72-hour period. And there's that word omissions again. You know, if I omit the safety of my child and they are sexually abused when there was a potential of that happening, the perpetrator can be charged with sexual abuse. I can be charged with sexual abuse by omission because I failed to keep the child safe. When we're talking about sexual abuse and criminal code, all of you have a handout, and in that handout, part of it is Iowa statutes. You know, I'm not going to refer to it as there specifically as a reference or a resource for you, but those are all the Iowa codes on sexual assault, sexual abuse. When we're talking about that, these are some of the subcategories of child sexual abuse that are in the criminal code. We're not going to spend time with them. You see there's quite a wide variety, including the fact that it doesn't matter how old the child is. They have a 100% right to privacy and nudity. No one has the right to inappropriately touch. No one has the right to photograph any sexually oriented parts of their body, you know, unless it's a medical procedure and it's part of that. Sex based on age. Civil law does not have an age of consent for children in sexual activities. So you can have 2 5-year-olds playing doctor, which is generally considered part of as a sexual activity. You can have a 13-year-old going in for testing, for screening, you know, for birth control, etc. So from a civil standpoint, there really isn't a law. You know, as far as hard and fact rules for anybody over the age of 14, that's really going to be depending on, again, that's criminal code. We're not going to specifically address that, you know, but that's going to particularly be with the age, what happened, who's the perpetrator, etc. Sometimes people will challenge me on statutory rape. I'm not an attorney. I'm not going to deal with that. That's criminal law. There is a comment about there's a 4-year age gap or greater between child and alleged perpetrator. Again, that's criminal code. In addition to that, in your handouts, you do have a page that says sex acts. And down the column on the left is the age of the child. Across the top is the age of the alleged perpetrator. And so you can see from a criminal standpoint what they can be charged with. But then let's use a couple examples of how that might happen, what might be the difference in the reactions. Say I walk into my house and there is my 16-year-old having sex with this guy. I don't like him. She's been told she's not to have anything to do with him at all. You know, he's definitely not allowed in my house, and here he's having sex with my daughter. I want him out of here. I'm going to call the police. I'm going to report him for rape. Okay, so generally, law enforcement will also get Department of Human Services involved in that, since I didn't call them. So it's a possibility or probability that it may be a joint evaluation. So from a Department of Human Services standpoint, okay, we have a